Texas, 1945. Spring rain drummed against the wooden roof of the interrogation room at Fort Clark, where 3 German women sat in silence, hands folded, eyes downward. They were prisoners. They were pregnant. And they refused to speak the names. The American officers across the table shifted through papers, voices rising with each unanswered question, while outside the window, guard towers stood against a darkening sky. The military demanded answers. The women offered only silence. What happened next would force the United States Army to confront questions it had never prepared to ask. The spring of 1945 brought victories across Europe, but it also brought complications no military manual had anticipated. By late April, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, American commanders faced an unexpected problem in their stateside prisoner camps. Female prisoners, captured as auxiliaries to German forces or detained in occupied territories, were arriving on American soil, and some were pregnant. The numbers remained small. Official records from the War Department noted fewer than 200 female German prisoners held in continental United States facilities by war's end. But the presence of pregnant women among them created immediate administrative chaos. Medical officers filed reports. Legal advisors scrambled through Geneva Convention protocols. And camp commanders sent urgent cables to Washington, asking what the regulations required when a prisoner refused to identify the father of her unborn child. Fort Clark, positioned in the dry hills of southwest Texas, became the primary holding facility for female German prisoners transferred from various camps. The compound stretched across former cavalry grounds, where Seminole scouts once trained and Buffalo soldiers had marched. Now it housed women who wore the gray-blue uniforms of German auxiliary services, their clothes marked with bright white letters spelling POW across the back. Lieutenant Colonel William Hartman commanded the facility. A career officer who had served in the Philippines before the war, Hartman approached problems with methodical precision. But nothing in his training prepared him for the meeting held in his office on April 23rd, when the camp physician, Dr. Sarah Whitmore, presented him with a situation unlike any he had encountered. 3 women were pregnant. All 3 refused to provide the name of the father, and all 3 claimed they had been assaulted, but could not or would not identify their attacker. Dr. Whitmore laid the medical files on Hartman's desk. The women ranged in age from 19 to 24. 2 had served in communication units near Berlin. 1 had worked in an administrative office in Munich. They arrived at Fort Clark in February, transferred from a camp in New Jersey after concerns about overcrowding. Their pregnancies became evident during routine medical examinations in March. Hartman read through the reports while rain tapped against the window. Each file contained the same phrase, written in Dr. Whitmore's precise handwriting. Patient refuses to identify father. Claims assault occurred, but provides no details regarding time, place, or perpetrator. The law was clear on some matters. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners. It mandated medical care for pregnant women. It established protocols for childbirth and infant care. But it said nothing about paternity. Nothing about what authorities should do when a prisoner would not name the father. Nothing about the possibility that the father might be an American soldier. That possibility hung in the room like smoke. Neither Hartman nor Dr. Whitmore spoke it aloud at first, but both understood the implications. If an American serviceman had assaulted a prisoner, it represented a violation of military law and international treaty. If the women were lying, protecting German soldiers who had fathered children before capture, that mattered less for legal purposes, but still raised questions about camp security and prisoner relationships before their detention. Hartman assigned Captain James Morrison, the camp's legal officer, to interview the women. Morrison was 31, a lawyer from Baltimore who had volunteered after Pearl Harbor. He spoke some German, learned from his grandmother, who had emigrated before the First War. He approached the interviews with care, aware that every question carried weight beyond the immediate situation. The first interview took place in a small room off the main administrative building. 2 female guards stood by the door. Dr. Whitmore sat in the corner, present at the prisoner's request. The woman's name was Greta Zimmerman. She was 22, born in Dresden, trained as a telegraph operator. She had been captured near Bremen in March, part of a communications unit that surrendered without resistance as American forces advanced. Morrison asked the questions in English first, then repeated them in his uncertain German. Greta understood English well enough to answer directly. She sat with perfect posture, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Morrison's shoulder. "Can you tell me when you became pregnant?" "I do not know the exact date. Do you know who the father is?" "I know." "Will you tell me his name?" "No." "Was it someone in your unit before you were captured?" "I will not answer that." "Were you assaulted?" "Yes." "By an American soldier?" "I will not answer that." Morrison tried different approaches. He explained that if an American serviceman had assaulted her, the military would prosecute. He explained that refusing to provide information could result in disciplinary action, though he knew the regulations remained unclear about what action could legally be taken. He explained that the baby would need a birth certificate, that records required a father's name or at least an acknowledgement of unknown paternity. Greta listened to everything. Then she repeated the same answer. "I will not provide that information." The second interview with Anna Vogt followed the same pattern. Anna was 24, from Hamburg, captured while attempting to flee Berlin with her unit. She had worked in supply logistics. She carried herself with a hardness Morrison found difficult to read. When he asked about the pregnancy, she met his eyes directly. "I was assaulted. I will not name the man. That is all I will say." The third woman, Lisa Hoffmann, was 19. She had the softest voice of the 3, and Morrison noticed her hands trembled slightly as she answered questions. She had worked in an administrative office, filing reports and typing correspondence. She had been captured in Munich, in an office building where American troops found her destroying documents. Lisa's answers matched the others almost exactly. She knew she was pregnant. She knew who the father was. She refused to name him. When Morrison asked if she had been assaulted, she nodded. When he asked where or when, she looked down at her hands and said nothing more. Morrison filed his report that evening. 3 prisoners, 3 pregnancies, 3 refusals to provide information. His conclusion was carefully worded. The consistency of their responses suggests either coordination or a shared experience that makes them unwilling to speak. Further investigation required. Hartman forwarded the report to the War Department with his own addendum. This situation requires clear guidance from higher authority. Medical care is being provided. Prisoners are being monitored. But without cooperation, we cannot determine if crimes have been committed by American personnel or if other factors are involved. The response came 3 weeks later in mid-May. By then, the war in Europe had ended. Celebrations had swept through American camps. German prisoners heard the news with varied reactions. Some wept, some remained silent. Some seemed relieved that the fighting had finally stopped. The directive from Washington was brief. Continue efforts to obtain information. If prisoners persist in refusing, document refusal and proceed with standard medical care. Do not compel statements. Monitor situation and report any developments. For Hartman, the directive solved nothing. It authorized him to do exactly what he was already doing and provided no new tools or authority. The women remained silent. The pregnancies progressed. And questions multiplied. Dr. Whitmore became the primary point of contact with the 3 women. She conducted weekly examinations, monitoring their health and the development of their babies. She observed that the women spoke little to each other, despite being housed in the same barracks section. They maintained a distance as if an unspoken agreement kept them apart. In June, Dr. Whitmore noted something else. Other female prisoners had begun treating the 3 pregnant women with a strange deference. They gave them extra food from their rations. They helped with heavy work assignments. They formed a protective circle during recreation hours in the yard. Dr. Whitmore mentioned this to Morrison during one of their regular meetings. "There is something happening among the prisoners that we are not seeing," she said. "Some social dynamic or code we do not understand." Morrison had been thinking the same thing. He had watched the women during yard time, noting the patterns of movement and interaction. The pregnant women never stood alone. Other prisoners always positioned themselves nearby, not obviously guarding, but clearly present. When American guards approached, conversations stopped mid-sentence. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of formal interviews, he began having casual conversations with other female prisoners, talking about conditions in the camp, about news from Germany, about anything that might lead to information about the pregnant women. The conversations were always conducted with female guards present, always documented, always careful to avoid coercion. Most prisoners deflected his questions smoothly. They knew nothing about the pregnancies. They barely knew the women. Everyone kept to themselves, they said, which Morrison knew was not remotely true. But in late June, one woman spoke. Her name was Margarethe Schneider. She was 41, old enough to be a mother to most of the younger prisoners. She had worked as a nurse in a German field hospital before being captured. She had a directness that Morrison found refreshing after weeks of evasion. They sat in the same interview room where Morrison had questioned the pregnant women. Margarethe looked at him with tired eyes and spoke in clear English. "You want to know why they will not tell you the names?" "Yes, because they are protecting their children." "From what?" "From being called bastards. From being labeled the children of rape. From growing up with that stain on their lives." Morrison considered this. But if they were assaulted, the men responsible should face justice. Margarethe shook her head slowly. "You do not understand. Justice means trials. Trials mean testimony. Testimony means these women standing in a courtroom, telling what happened to them in detail, having lawyers question every moment, every decision they made. And then what? The men get punished, maybe. The women are still the German prisoners who accused American soldiers. The babies are still the evidence of that crime, walking around with that knowledge forever." She leaned forward slightly. "They have decided it is better to say nothing, to let people wonder, to protect their children from knowing the exact circumstances of their conception. Do you understand? They are making a choice about what kind of story their children will inherit." Morrison asked if she knew the fathers' identities. Margarethe sat back and looked at him with something like pity. "Even if I did," she said, "I would not tell you. This is their decision to make." The conversation stayed with Morrison for days. He included it in his next report, noting that the silence might be a deliberate strategy to protect the children rather than the perpetrators. Hartman read it and added his own observation. "If this is true, we face an ethical dilemma. We cannot compel women to testify against their will, especially if they believe silence serves the best interests of their children." By July, the situation had reached a strange equilibrium. The women received excellent medical care. They attended prenatal classes organized by Dr. Whitmore. They worked reduced hours in the camp kitchens, doing light tasks appropriate to their condition. They remained silent about paternity. But then a new element entered the situation. Major General Theodore Winters arrived at Fort Clark for an inspection tour. Winters was a decorated officer who had commanded troops in North Africa and Sicily. He had a reputation for decisiveness and intolerance for administrative ambiguity. When he learned about the pregnant prisoners, he demanded a briefing. Hartman, Morrison, and Dr. Whitmore presented the situation in the camp conference room. Winters listened without interruption, his face growing darker as they explained the refusals, the inconclusive interviews, the protective behavior of other prisoners. When they finished, Winters tapped his finger on the table. This is unacceptable. We have a duty to investigate potential crimes against prisoners. We have a duty to identify the fathers of these children for legal and medical records. We have a duty to maintain order and discipline. He turned to Morrison. You are telling me that these women simply refuse to cooperate, and we accept that? Morrison chose his words carefully. They have rights as prisoners under international law. We cannot torture them for information. We cannot threaten their medical care. We cannot punish them in ways that violate treaty obligations. Winters waved this away. I am not talking about torture. I am talking about using every legal tool at our disposal. These women are carrying evidence. When the babies are born, we can conduct blood tests. We can compare the results against American personnel. We can identify the fathers through medical science. Dr. Whitmore spoke up. Sir, blood typing can rule out potential fathers, but cannot definitively identify them. The science is not precise enough for what you are suggesting. Winters looked at her. Then we improve the science. We consult with experts. We use whatever methods are available. These women can refuse to speak, but they cannot refuse biology. The meeting ended with Winters ordering a full investigation into available paternity testing methods. He wanted options on his desk within 2 weeks. He wanted protocols established for collecting blood samples from the babies at birth. He wanted a list of American personnel who had been present at camps where the women were held before transfer to Fort Clark. After Winters left, Hartman sat in his office and stared at the wall. Dr. Whitmore and Morrison remained with him, none of them speaking for several minutes. Finally, Hartman said what they were all thinking. This is going to become something much larger than 3 pregnant women. The investigation Winters ordered expanded rapidly. Within days, military intelligence officers arrived at Fort Clark with files and authorization to interview everyone who had been stationed at camps in New Jersey and New York, where the women had previously been held. They questioned guards, medical staff, administrative personnel, and other prisoners. The interviews revealed nothing concrete. No one admitted to having sexual contact with prisoners. No one reported seeing inappropriate behavior between American personnel and German women. No one could point to a specific incident or individual. But the investigation did uncover something else. Records showed that security protocols at the New Jersey camp had been inconsistent. Guard rotations had not been properly logged. Prisoner work assignments had been changed without documentation. And there had been at least 3 instances where male guards had been reprimanded for entering female prisoner sections without proper authorization or female guard accompaniment. Morrison reviewed these findings and felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Something had happened. Whether it was assault, consensual relationships that violated regulations, or something more complex, something had definitely happened. And the people involved had covered their tracks well enough that identifying them now would be nearly impossible without cooperation from the women themselves. In August, a team of medical researchers from Walter Reed Hospital arrived at Fort Clark. They brought new testing methods, developed during the war for battlefield medicine, and now being explored for paternity determination. The tests were not definitive, but they could narrow possibilities considerably when combined with blood typing and other factors. Dr. Whitmore met with the research team and reviewed their protocols. Then she met with the 3 pregnant women and explained what the military planned to do. After birth, blood samples would be taken from the babies. The samples would be tested and compared against samples from American personnel who had been at previous camps. The goal was to identify or rule out potential fathers. The women listened without expression. Greta asked a single question. Can they force us to allow this? Dr. Whitmore answered honestly. I do not know. The legal status is unclear. They will argue that the babies are born on American soil and subject to American law. They will argue that determining paternity serves the child's best interests. You would need lawyers to fight it, and I do not know if the military will provide adequate legal representation for prisoners challenging military policy. That evening, the three women requested a group meeting with Morrison. It was the first time they had asked to speak with him rather than responding to his questions. He agreed immediately and arranged for the meeting the following morning. They met in the same interview room, but the dynamic had shifted. The women sat together on one side of the table, presenting a united front. Morrison sat across from them with a legal pad and pen, waiting. Greta spoke for the group. "We understand the military plans to test our baby's blood after birth. We understand you will compare it to samples from American soldiers. We want you to know that we will not cooperate with this process in any way that we can refuse." Morrison nodded. "I understand your position, but the military has indicated it will proceed regardless of your cooperation." Anna spoke next, her voice hard. "Then you should understand what you are doing. You are treating our babies as evidence. You are telling us that our children exist primarily as proof of crimes or violations of regulations. You are starting their lives by defining them through biology and blame." Lisa added, softer, "There is another way. Let us register the fathers as unknown. Let the babies have normal birth certificates with that notation. Let them grow up without the burden of investigations and tests and trials. Let them be children, not evidence." Morrison felt the weight of their argument, but he also knew the position the military had taken. General Winters wants answers. He believes identifying the fathers serves justice and protects good order and discipline. Greta leaned forward. "Whose justice? Whose order? If American soldiers assaulted us, justice would require our testimony, our reliving of trauma, our public exposure. If German soldiers fathered these children before our capture, identifying them serves no purpose because they are beyond your reach in destroyed Germany. Either way, the only ones who suffer from this investigation are us and our babies." She paused, then continued, "We have made a choice. These children will be born. They will be cared for. They will not know the details of their conception. That is the greatest protection we can offer them. Your tests will not change that. You can force samples from our babies, but you cannot force us to acknowledge or accept your findings. In our hearts, in our stories, these children have no fathers. They have only mothers who protected them from a truth that would poison their lives." Morrison included this conversation in his report, adding his own assessment. "The women have articulated a clear ethical framework for their refusal. They are not protecting perpetrators. They are protecting their children from inheriting identities built on violence or shame. The military's insistence on testing appears to prioritize institutional concerns over the welfare of the children involved." Hartman forwarded the report with his strongest recommendation yet. "I urge reconsideration of the testing protocol. The women have legitimate concerns about the impact on their children. Proceeding against their will may create more problems than it solves." The response from Washington arrived in early September. "Proceed with testing protocols as outlined. Document all refusals and non-cooperation. Ensure legal compliance with Geneva Convention requirements regarding medical procedures on prisoners." The babies were born in October and November. Greta delivered first, a girl she named Helene. Anna's son came 3 weeks later, named Johann. Lisa's daughter arrived in mid-November, named Maria. All 3 births proceeded normally. Dr. Whitmore attended each one, and she noted that the mothers showed appropriate emotional responses and bonding behaviors. The babies were healthy, alert, and developing well. According to the protocols Winters had ordered, blood samples were collected from each baby within 48 hours of birth. The samples were labeled, documented, and sent to Walter Reed Hospital for analysis. Samples were simultaneously collected from 114 American service members who had been stationed at facilities where the women had been held. The testing took 6 weeks. Results came back in early January 1946. The analysis ruled out 87 potential fathers based on blood type incompatibility. Of the remaining 27 men, the tests could narrow the list to 11 whose blood characteristics made them possible fathers. But the science could not distinguish between these 11 with any certainty. Morrison read the results and felt no satisfaction. The military had proven that blood testing was not the definitive answer Winters had hoped for. They had a list of 11 men who might be fathers, but no way to prove which one. And pursuing those men would require invasions of their privacy, potential damage to their reputations, and investigations that could drag on for years with no guarantee of resolution. Hartman made a decision. He drafted a final report to the War Department outlining the situation and recommending that the matter be closed. His reasoning was pragmatic and humane. The testing has not provided definitive answers. Further investigation would be costly and invasive. The women continue to refuse cooperation. The babies are healthy and being cared for. No purpose is served by continued pursuit of identification. The War Department accepted his recommendation in February 1946. The investigation was officially closed. The birth certificates for all 3 babies listed father unknown. The women would remain prisoners until repatriation agreements were finalized, at which point they could choose to return to Germany or petition for other arrangements. But the story had one more turn. In March, Dr. Whitmore called Morrison to the medical office. She had news that complicated everything further. 2 of the women, Greta and Lisa, had applied for permission to remain in the United States after repatriation eligibility. They cited concerns about conditions in Germany, lack of family support, and desire to give their children opportunities in America. The applications would require State Department review, background checks, and sponsorship by American citizens or organizations. Morrison asked the obvious question, do they have sponsors? Dr. Whitmore handed him a folder. They do. Multiple offers, actually. Church groups, women's organizations, community sponsors in Texas and New Mexico. People who learned about their situation and wanted to help. Morrison read through the letters. The sponsors described the women as courageous, protective mothers who deserved support. They praised their refusal to cooperate with investigations that would have harmed their children. They offered housing, job assistance, and community integration. Anna, Dr. Whitmore added, has chosen to return to Germany. She has family in the western zones and believes she can rebuild there. But Greta and Lisa want to stay. The applications moved through bureaucratic channels slowly. The war had ended, but its complications lingered. Processing prisoner releases, repatriation, and immigration cases created enormous backlogs. Greta and Lisa waited in Fort Clark with their babies, living in a strange limbo between prisoner and immigrant. During this time, something shifted in the camp. Other prisoners who were returning to Germany began asking the 2 women about their decision to stay. Some questioned it. Some understood it. But all recognized it as an act of remarkable courage or desperate necessity, depending on perspective. Margarete Schneider, the older nurse who had spoken to Morrison months earlier, told Dr. Whitmore something that she asked to be recorded. These women are rewriting their own stories. They are choosing futures for their children that break from past trauma. Whether that is wise or possible, I do not know. But I admire their determination to try. The approvals came in June 1946. Greta and Lisa were granted permission to remain in the United States under provisional status. They would be released from military custody, placed with sponsors, and allowed to work and establish residence. After 5 years, they could apply for permanent status if they maintained good standing. Lisa accepted sponsorship from a Catholic women's organization in San Antonio. They offered her housing in a supervised residence and job training as a seamstress. Greta chose a family in Fredericksburg, a Texas town with strong German heritage, where she would work in a bakery and live in an apartment above the shop. Their final day at Fort Clark came in early July. Dr. Whitmore helped them pack their belongings, such as they were. Morrison arranged transportation and delivered paperwork explaining their status and restrictions. Hartman met with them briefly to wish them well. Before they left, Morrison asked if they would tell him one thing off the record. He asked if they had been assaulted or if the relationships had been consensual. Greta looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Does it matter now? We made our choice. Our daughters will grow up American. They will never need to know the circumstances of their birth. That is the gift we gave them by staying silent." Lisa added, "You wanted justice. We wanted protection. Those are not always the same thing." They left Fort Clark in a military transport truck, babies in their arms, traveling toward uncertain futures with the only certainty that mattered to them. They had protected their children from a truth they believed would cause more harm than good. Anna returned to Germany in August. Records show she settled near Hamburg, remarried in 1949, and raised Johann in a household with 2 half-siblings. She never spoke publicly about her time as a prisoner or about Johann's father. The 11 American service members identified as possible fathers through blood testing were never officially informed of the results. The investigation had been closed, and the War Department decided that contacting them would serve no constructive purpose. Some likely knew or suspected they might be involved. Others may never have connected their actions to the pregnant prisoners. The silence that the women had created extended to protect or shield these men as well. Fort Clark converted to other uses in the following years, eventually becoming a retirement community and historic site. The interrogation room where Morrison had conducted interviews still exists, now a museum space with period furniture and explanatory plaques. None of the plaques mention the 3 pregnant women or the investigation that once consumed the camp as commanders. Greta lived in Fredericksburg until 1983. She worked in the same bakery for 37 years, became a naturalized citizen in 1952, and raised Helene as a single mother. Helene married a local rancher, had 3 children, and never learned the full details of her mother's wartime experience until after Greta's death, when she found letters and documents among her mother's possessions. Lisa remained in San Antonio, worked as a seamstress, and later as a bookkeeper, and raised Maria with help from the Catholic Women's Organization that had sponsored her. Maria became a teacher, married a military officer ironically, and had 2 daughters. Lisa died in 1991, and Maria delivered a eulogy that described her mother as the strongest person she had ever known. A woman who had protected her from shadows, Maria sensed but never fully understood. The testing protocols developed for the Fort Clark case were refined and improved in subsequent decades. DNA analysis eventually made paternity determination far more accurate than the blood typing methods of 1945. But the ethical questions the case raised remain unresolved. When does a mother's right to protect her child supersede institutional demands for identification? When does silence serve justice better than forced disclosure? When does biology matter less than the stories we tell about where we come from? In 2003, a genealogy researcher contacted Helene, Greta's daughter, with information suggesting she might have found Helene's biological father. The researcher had been compiling military records and had cross-referenced the Fort Clark investigation files that had been declassified in the USA 1990s. She believed she could identify which of the 11 possible men was most likely. Helene says father, based on additional research and family trees. Helene declined the information. In a brief email response that the researcher later shared with the Historical Society, Helene wrote, "My mother made a choice about what I needed to know. She spent her entire life protecting me from a story she believed would hurt more than it would help. I honor that choice. I honor her sacrifice. Whatever name you have found does not change who I am or who she was." Maria made a different choice when approached with similar information in 2005. She requested the researchers' findings, reviewed them, and spent several months deciding what to do. Eventually, she made contact with the family of a man who had served at the New Jersey camp where her mother had been held. The man had died in 1987, but his children were alive. The meeting was awkward, painful, and ultimately inconclusive. The family acknowledged that their father had served at the camp. They could not confirm or deny whether he had been involved with prisoners. They appreciated Maria's reaching out, but preferred not to pursue the matter further. Maria respected their position and did not push for DNA testing or further confirmation. In interviews years later, Maria described the experience as necessary, but not satisfying. She said, "I needed to know who I might have come from. But my mother was right that the knowing does not change anything essential. I am still me. She was still the mother who protected me. A man's name does not add anything meaningful to my life, and it brought pain to his other children who had nothing to do with what happened." The story of the three women and their refusal to name fathers has appeared in various historical accounts of POW camps, women's experiences in World War II, and legal discussions about reproductive rights and prisoner autonomy. It remains a complicated case, resistant to simple moral interpretations. Some historians argue the women were protecting rapists and that the military should have pursued the investigations more aggressively. They point out that allowing sexual assault to go unpunished sends dangerous messages about accountability and the treatment of vulnerable prisoners. Other historians argue the women were exercising the only real power they had in a situation where they were powerless. By refusing to cooperate, they controlled the narrative of their children's origins and prevented their babies from being defined by trauma or scandal. Still, other historians focus on the institutional response, noting that the military's demand for testing reflected an obsession with control and documentation that valued institutional interests over individual welfare. They argue that accepting the women as silence would have been the more humane and ultimately more just response. The truth likely contains elements of all these perspectives. The women made choices in impossible circumstances. The military responded according to its institutional priorities and legal obligations. The children grew up with partial stories and incomplete knowledge, and everyone involved carried forward consequences that lasted far longer than the war itself. What remains clear is that silence can be a form of protection, that sometimes refusing to speak serves purposes that compelled speech would undermine, that mothers making impossible choices about their children's futures deserve to have those choices respected, even when institutions and authorities disagree. The three women, in their different ways, tried to write new chapters for their children. They refused the stories that investigations and tests would have imposed. They chose blank spaces over painful details. They protected mysteries over exposing wounds. Whether that was right or wrong, wise or foolish, just or unjust, depends on whose perspective you take and what values you prioritize. But it was their choice to make. And in making it, they taught their children something about autonomy, protection, and the power of a mother's love to shield even when she cannot heal.